Hello everyone, Mark Anson Audio here. Today I want to give you 10 tips for if you're going into the studio for the first time and you've never been into a recording session before in your life. Tip number 1. Learn to play to a click or a metronome. So there is this very horrible and frustrating thing among musicians, especially younger musicians, that playing to a click, recording to a click, or practicing to a metronome is lame in some way. There is nothing more important in music than being able to play in time. Even if that just means you're sat at home playing the same 4 chords over and over again in time with a metronome, or sitting practicing scales to a metronome, these things make you a better musician and it makes you better forever. It's good practice to get into. When you go into a recording studio, it's very, very likely you will be expected to play it to a click track. Now, the main reason for this is the only way you can really get away with not playing to a click track is if you have a huge studio where all the musicians are playing at the same time, so you need a massive facility, loads of microphones, the whole room needs to sound great, and the whole band needs to be absolutely tight as crazy. However, large recording sessions like this are quite rare now. Chances are you'll be asked to record instruments individually due to size constraints, and to do recording of instruments individually, to do it in any decent way, you need to play to a click track. So practice to a click track. There's no getting out of that. If you're the kind of person that thinks you're too good to play to a click track or metronome, chances are you're the kind of person that needs to play to a click track or metronome. It's no offense, it's just standard studio practice. Tip number 2, learn what a tempo map is and how to build one. So a tempo map is basically how your song changes in time, in tempo, and also in time signatures throughout the course of a song. If you've written a very simple song, it might just be the same tempo throughout and maybe in 4/4 time signatures. That's like the majority of pop music is exactly that. However, if you write more complicated music, maybe there's tempo increases, decreases, maybe there's some time signature changes throughout the song. If that's the case, then a standard click track is not going to work throughout the whole song. You need to build a tempo map. So basically this is, if you don't have the technical knowledge, what you need to do is sit down with a pen and paper and work out what it is you are playing over time. What is the time signature? What is the tempo? And how do these change over time? And at what periods in the song? Very, very basic time signature theory is not complicated to learn and will make you a better musician for the rest of your life. So like, you don't need to learn crazy, you don't need to go on a degree course to learn about basic time signature theory. Trust me, it's very simple. Learn it. All you need to do is be able to click your fingers in time and count. That's all you need to do, but I recommend you learn it. If you have someone who has the technical know-how to build a tempo map or a time signature map within a DAW, something like Pro Tools, Cubase, Reaper, whatever, then ask them if they can then program that time signature map and tempo map in for you, because you can actually take those files with you to the studio on the day and give them to your engineer. And all they need to do is drag and drop them in, and their click track will automatically adjust in time and tempo and in time signature changes to go with that tempo map, and it will save you loads of time on the day. Tip number 3, practice in isolation to that click track. So when you're in the studio, as I said earlier, it's very likely you will be asked to play and record individually. Now this can actually be quite awkward and unnatural depending on what instrument you're playing and what particular part that you're playing within a song. If you're only doing an accompanying bass part that's quite slow and it's not very complicated, then it can actually be really difficult to keep your mind where you are in the song if the song's like, say, 7 minutes long. So practicing to that tempo map click track in advance and kind of being like learning to count the bars, how, like, when are you resting, when are you coming back in, is a very important skill, because recording can feel quite unnatural at times when you're recording in isolation. So practicing this in advance will make your day in the studio go much smoother. And if that means you need to write on a bit of paper, hey, like, play for 4 bars, play this bit, then don't play, then do that. Write all down, get it all on a bit of paper so you can keep that in the studio with you while you're recording to keep you on track. Tip number 4. As a band, listen to every instrument individually. So this is what I would call like a sort of pre-studio thing I recommend every band does. I demand every band does before I record with them. Is to go off to like a practice room somewhere where everyone's present and choose a song and everyone play their individual part and everyone else listens to what they're playing. So that might sound kind of silly and like quite pointless, especially if you play with like live gigs all the time. You're like, well, yeah, I know what everyone else is playing. But you'd be surprised the number of times I've been in the studio and say I've recorded a guitar part and then the other guitarist has been like, I didn't know you were playing that. Or the drummer would be like, why are you playing that bit then? You should play it this bit here. So sit down as a band and really listen to and analyze every instrument and see what everything's doing. You'd be amazed at how many times little confusions can occur. And again, all these little confusions are much better to figure out before you go into the studio. Are there little bits where the timing isn't matching up? Are there little bits where the notes are actually clashing? Figure this out before you get into the studio. Tip number 5. Change your strings on stringed instruments a few days in advance. So standard recording practice, if you're going to record a stringed instrument, notorious ones, guitar and bass, is to change your strings, get nice new fresh strings so they sound nice and bright. However, it's good to do it a few days before you go into the studio and play them in a little bit. A lot of people find when they change their strings, there can be a period of adjustment where the tuning tends to go in and out a little bit, and it takes a few days of just playing the strings in to help them sit and stay in tune. Okay, tip number 6. Bring a book. Right, that might sound like a really silly idea, but being in the studio all day can actually be kind of dull depending on what your particular role is to play. If you've played, say, your guitar part on a song and you're not needed for another few hours, what you don't want to be doing is sitting around the recording studio sort of silently judging other people and putting pressure on them because you're bored and want to do your next bit. It can be very frustrating when someone's sitting behind the glass and they're trying to record and the rest of the band are sat there on the other side of the glass just staring at them. Bring a book, be prepared to go outside, go for a walk or go for lunch until you're needed in the studio. If you're not needed in the studio for a few hours, then you are a hindrance in the studio. So prepare to entertain yourself. Tip number 7. Understand the difference between the recording stage, the mixing stage, and the mastering stage. These are 3 completely separate stages, only one of which you will be doing on that recording day in the studio. So recording is what it sounds like. It's the recording of all the instruments. What it is not is the mixing stage. A lot of people confuse these two things and try and do them at the same time. That's not what you're there for. On the day of recording, your job is to get the best performances and the best takes of all the individual instruments. The mixing stage happens completely separately, sometimes with none of the band present. In fact, usually with none of the band present, where a mixing engineer will have all of the nicely perfected recordings that are all done, and then they will mix and balance them and get the EQs on them, compress them, put reverbs on them, all that stuff. That does not happen on the day of recording. I've been in the recording studio sometimes and I've had the band sitting behind me being like, hey, can you put the vocal up, or can you put the drums up over here, or hey, can we make the guitar sound bigger in that section? That's not the right time to do that. The recording stage, you're just there to get the best performances and the cleanest recordings that you can. All that other stuff comes in the mixing stage separately. The mastering stage comes even after the mixing stage. The mastering stage is where you end up, you've got your mixes, which are just stereo tracks at this point. What you want is, like, say if you're doing an EP, you'll have 4 stereo tracks, for example. The mastering stage, a mastering engineer will listen to all these tracks, they'll put in maybe some fade-ins, fade-outs, they will try to create a sort of overall sonic balance between the songs and whatnot. Again, this is completely separate from the mixing stage. So just understand the basic principles. Recording stage, mixing stage, mastering stage are different things. Tip number 8, recording vocals can be pretty intimidating. So a lot of times, if it's a vocalist's first time in a studio, things tend not to go super well. Recording can be a very unnatural experience, especially for vocalists. If they're just sat there, they've got the music coming in through their headphones, and being asked to get a perfect take can be very difficult and very stressful, especially when someone's like literally listening to every single note that you make and making sure it's perfect. It can be very intense and unnatural. So this goes back a little bit to what I mentioned earlier. If you're not needed in the studio while the vocalist is recording, get out the studio. The best situation is usually just the engineer, just the singer, everyone else away doing something else, nowhere near them. It can be very difficult, very stressful, so let the singer relax. I also recommend singers do like vocal exercises and vocal warm-ups before they go into the studio and for the week running up to the time in the studio. There are tons of free resources online about vocal warm-ups and vocal exercises. Do all these in advance. It will make your day much better. Tip number 9, don't be afraid to ask the engineer to restart the take you are currently recording. So, being in the studio can be quite a long day, quite laborious. If you are, say, you're playing a guitar part and you make a little bit of a mistake in your solo halfway through, don't finish that whole solo and then be like, hey, can I actually just do the whole thing again? If you make a bum note and you already know that you're not going to be happy with this take, don't be afraid to stop and say to the engineer, hey, can we just restart quickly? Because for the engineer, chances are all they have to do is press stop, undo, and restart. What you don't want to do is sit and play like a whole 2-minute long passage and burn yourself out and knacker yourself out, especially if you're doing vocals. You really don't want to spend like 4 hours straight like trying to sing the same passage and burning your vocals out. If you're not happy, just ask for the engineer to restart or like a little 5-minute break if that's what you need. The engineer is your friend, they are not your enemy. They want things to go easy for you. So make it easy for yourself. Tip number 10 is the most obvious one. Practice. For the love of God, practice loads and loads before you go into the studio. Being in the studio when things are expensive, time seems to be moving incredibly quickly. That is the worst possible time for mistakes to come up or for you to realize the drummer hasn't learned their parts or the bassist thinks they're supposed to be playing an F at that point, but they're supposed to be playing an E. These are the worst possible times to figure that out. The only way to get over that is to practice. If you look into like old recording sessions of like musicians in like the 60s and the early 70s, the reason so many of these recordings are still amazing is these musicians were like full-time professional musicians. They were incredible. Now the barrier to entry for musicians getting into the studio is actually really low. Like for me, I've got a bedroom recording thing. I can record anyone off the street. It doesn't necessarily mean they're good enough to be recording. They still have to practice first, otherwise the recording session isn't going to go well. A good performance will always sound great. You can go into the best studio in the world, but if you haven't practiced, it's not going to be a good session. So practice, and everything will be fine. Anyway, my name has been Mark Anson Audio. I hope you enjoyed this little kind of introductory tip to the recording experience. I hope it didn't sound too grim and depressing. It didn't necessarily mean for it to be like that. It can be a very stressful time in the studio, but ultimately the finished product is always really exciting for both the engineer and the band as a whole to come together and create this cool thing. So recording stuff is great. It's just can be quite difficult at times. Please subscribe to the channel if you like more videos like this, and I'll see you guys later. Adios.